You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. You're listening to The Spectral Zone with host Kaz Rooney.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Spectral Zone on Parasearch Radio. I am Kaz Rooney, I'm your host for the show, and tonight I've been joined by a very special guest. I'm so excited about this. I am being joined by Dacre Stoker. Hello, Dacre.
Hello, Cass. How are you?
I am good. How are you?
I'm nice and warm and toasty in sunny South Carolina in the USA myself. What's it like where you are?
It's cold. It is very cold.
Well, hopefully we'll warm it up with an awesome program tonight.
Yeah, I hope so. I've been so excited about this show, and I know a lot of people are really excited about this show. You are an author yourself, but you're also, you are you are the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker.
It's a big shoes to fill, and it's an honor. I try to tell people that, I only got into the writing myself late in the game. I was a school teacher and an athlete and a coach at the Olympic level, but I've just recently, sort of in the past 10 years, turned my energies towards helping the world learn a little bit more about my famous relative, and doing co-authoring on a fictional book, a continuation of Dracula. In the process, I did a book of nonfiction, as I found Bram's Lost Journal, and then coming out in October is another book, which is a prequel to Dracula. And in between, plenty of lectures in all kinds of weird places around the world, exciting weird places, and a couple of television documentaries. So I've been busy.
Wow. Now, what I want to ask you, as you were growing up, were you aware of your family's history as you were growing up?
I joke a little bit about that, Cass, because I try to tell people, don't worry. It was a very normal childhood. There wasn't the Addams Family or the Munsters, on my street. We were very normal. But there was this sort of ribbing I'd get from friends at Halloween time when people would, my friends would come to the door. Joke with me. Are you going to take my blood? Or are you going to give me some candy? And Wow. It was funny for a little while, but after a while it got a little bit tiring. But once I got old enough to sort of get the courage up to ask my father, what are they talking about? What's really the story here? And this was sort of the mid 1970s, and he reached up into this bookcase, and there were some old books up there. And one of them was this mustard-colored book, and he pulled it down, and it was a first edition Dracula that Bram Stoker actually signed to his mother. And here it was sitting in the cupboard or shelf, I should say, along with some other first editions. And the connection is that Bram Stoker's youngest brother, George, was a doctor, and he had a son and a daughter. The daughter never married, but the son moved to Montreal, Canada after World War I, and that's my great-grandfather. And so he actually, my grandfather, he came to Canada looking for a war bride, married one, and they actually ended up having 3 boys, my dad and his 2 brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the beginning of how Bram Stoker's family, Bram was one of seven, and luckily one of them came over to Canada. And so those books obviously made their way to Dr. George Stoker, and then made their way to his son, and then made their way to us in Canada. And it wasn't really until, as I said, sort of mid to late 70s when two professors at Boston College University, Radu Floresco and Ray McNally, wrote a book called In Search of Dracula. And it was that book that I read first. I read that before Dracula. It was an easy read, and it was sort of opening up the eyes of the world to who Vlad Dracula was, maybe where Bram Stoker got his information and his motive. And that sort of started my interest. And then it wasn't until a few years later that I had the courage to sort of slough my way through Dracula, because, as you know, it's not an easy book to read, and I wasn't in university until I read it. So the childhood there was not a lot of Dracula involved, and it wasn't until really university that it was time for me to start thinking about this and reading it.
When you started looking into Bram's, obviously, you looked into Bram's past. I mean, as he was growing up, he was quite sickly as a child, wasn't he?
I'm glad you asked that, because I like when we start talking about Bram himself, and I'm sure we'll talk about Dracula tonight. But the fact that people and yourself are now interested in who Bram Stoker was as a person, and what kind of a person was he that led him to write this story and many others is of great interest. So, I was a school teacher, middle school through high school, science and physical education. So I sort of identified a little bit with this sickly young boy. First 7 years of his life, there was never anything written that anybody's ever found that says exactly what the illness was. But I believe it was something like respiratory allergies or asthma. And the reason I believe that is because he outgrew it. And he outgrew it at the age of 7, also because the Stoker family moved a number of times, and they moved away from the sort of the mildew and dampness of Clontarf and inland a little bit. And so it sort of coincided with those moving to slightly drier climates that Bram got better. And part of his rehabilitation was these long walks he would take. And as an athlete myself and a coach at the Olympic level, I can identify again with somebody overcoming challenges in their life by athletics. And the strong, vigorous guy that Bram Stoker became, he grew to be, 6'2", the tallest in his family by the time he went off to Trinity University, and became a champion long-distance race walker, a rugby player, a gymnast, a rower. And I think that's what gave him ultimate confidence. Imagine just, you're sickly, you don't know you're up in your room for 7 years, people are telling you stories, some of the weird things that happened in his life. He was told stories of premature burial during cholera epidemics.
Wow.
And I'm sure that traumatized him a bit, but he really came into his own because of athletics. And then that sort of academic creative side was able to flourish. So, Bram as a young boy is a very complex person, but he stayed pretty complex throughout his life. And that showed in a lot of his writings.
When you look at it, when you were looking through all the history, obviously you got an idea of who your uncle was and his life and how he grew up. So looking at that, what is your take on how he came about writing Dracula? What do you think inspired that?
There was a lot of things. I mean, and it's not just one, and that's kind of what's interesting. I mean, first of all, the personal experience he had, and I didn't mention this, but now I will. I believe during that 7 years of his illness that he was bloodlet by one of his uncles, and the type of illness that he had would have produced fevers. And I found on the internet one of his uncles was a famous fever doctor, and he wrote a treatise on how you treated this, and it was either leeching or cutting. Obviously, as we know now, they were a little misguided back in the days, taking out the blood. Usually it worked if there was a massive infection, but when they would take out blood if people had fevers, you were just actually making them weaker. So poor little Bram, had this, blood draining experience. And then after they were bloodlet, what they were given to help them regain their fluid levels was claret, was wine. And so he would be drunk as a little kid. So I honestly believe that there would be some sort of trauma created and a sort of almost like this drunkenness created that young Bram would be in and out of in his early years. And so many years later, when he started, writing and got to write the scene in Dracula's castle where Jonathan Harker is sort of bloodlet, so to speak, from the women in white, and he was depleted of his energy and couldn't mount his escape from the castle. A lot of that is very similar to what he experienced as a kid. So I just put that in the category of personal experience. And then he was also a guy that liked to get things right. He was a clerk in the Petty Sessions judicial system. He was very organized. When he went off to London and did his research for Dracula, he spent a lot of time in the British Library. And at his disposal, we know from his notes that there's lots of interesting information about the vampire scare of the 1700s in Europe, a lot of information by Emily Gerard, the Scottish lady living in Transylvania, about superstitions and mythology and so on. So he took existing superstitions in a strange part of the world and introduced them into Victorian London that scared the heck out of people. And he created what I term the perfect storm, a story that is supernatural, but made it very realistic in a realistic setting based on real events, real people, real places. And that's what made it real scary and very effective.
I mean, reading the book, and then obviously you've looked into the history. As you said, you found his journal as well. Someone had his journal, didn't they, in the family?
Yeah, he does have two great-grandsons still alive, and they have children. Yeah. So Bram had one son, Noel. Noel married, had a daughter, Anne. Then, of course, the Stoker name is gone in that line. But there was 3 offspring, and 2 of those gentlemen are still alive. And they have some of these really cool artifacts. And while I was doing my research for the first book I wrote with Ian Holt, Dracula the Undead, I discovered in the attic this lost journal. And that quickly became a secondary project, but it became a primary source of me getting into Bram's head. And just so your listeners fully understand this journal, what was cool about it was that Bram kept these random thoughts, ideas. Some ideas made their way into some of his stories later on in his life. Some of them were just practicing writing poetry, just jotting down observations of the streets of Dublin, some humorous things. But it was sort of a commonplace book that spanned 11 years of his life. And it was a very important 11 years. It was while he was still at Trinity, but working as a clerk in Petty Sessions. But then it also covered the time when he moved to London to work for Irving. So it was a time of great sort of liberation for Bram when he was, kind of confined to Dublin Castle doing very boring work, when all the while he wanted to sort of be a little more theatrical and creative. Bram was, as I said earlier, one of 7, but 3 of the brothers were studying to be doctors, very scientific minds. His 2 sisters were being taught in the arts, and his other brother was studying for civil service. So here is Bram, the one child in the family that actually needed to work at Dublin Castle, make an income because his father had retired, and also go to school. He was kind of dying to be this creative writer, and he loved the theater, and he made a deal with the newspaper in town to write theatrical reviews, which put him into that world that he enjoyed. But they were anonymous, and he didn't get paid for it. But it fulfilled a purpose. It gave him a creative outlet. But his father at one point sent him a letter when he thought of writing a play with an American actress that he had a crush on. Said, no, this theater is not for you. Stay away from that. That's not your world. And that kind of, I think, it pushed Bram down, and that's really sad. So it wasn't until the father and mother and the 2 sisters moved to Switzerland that Bram got the courage to move off to London to work for Irving, which then gave him the entree to the literary world, the creative world, and that's what opened up his world to writing. So that's sort of the type of guy that he was, and it gave him that ability to use that, theatrical side of drama in his writings and so on. And that's that perfect storm of many things coming together in his life that helped him write Dracula.
We actually have a question in the chat room from Gary Bradfield. And he's asking, have you ever been to Whitby, or have you any intentions of going to Whitby, because that's said to be part of the inspiration for Dracula?
Well, the answer, Gary, is absolutely yes. I've been to Whitby. I can't remember how many times now. It's been at least 5 or 6. I absolutely love Whitby. And yes, it was one of the places. Obviously, it had such a big impression on Bram in the summer of 1890 when he went there for a 2-week holiday with his wife and son. He actually went there a week before his wife and son came and joined him. And from what I understand from his notes to Dracula that live in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, he was really taken by the beauty of the village, but also the excitement, the vitality of the fishing fleet, the in and out of the harbor. Bram spent quite a lot of time chatting with the Coast Guard, the fishermen. He loved local lore. He loved the stories. He actually, which is strange, but you'll understand why, he loved the weather. And he actually took reports of the really horrible storms and jotted them down in his notebook because, of course, as we all know, he chose Whitby to set chapters 6, 7, and part of 8, but for the arrival of the Demeter. And so he actually found a real shipwreck, which was the Demeter, a Russian schooner, and turned it into Dmitri, coming from Varna. But he used the weather patterns that would have made, one heck of a storm, and a very plausible storm for a ship to come into the safety of the harbor and run aground, just as the Demeter did. So Bram was detail-oriented, but he also just, I think, loved the feel of Whitby. And I'll tell this to Gary and your other listeners. The first time I was there to do a filming of a documentary with a Canadian filming company, it was in a end of a January, and it was cold and misty. We arrived there at night, and we needed to go to the Duke of York to have a pint just to sort of get everybody into the mood to do our filming the next day. And the cobblestones were slippery and the fog was rolling in. And it was scary right from the start. It was a great atmosphere. And I could see why Bram would have chosen that. So I love the place, Gary. I've actually been there to the Met and done some of my Stoker on Stoker presentations. I think it's a lovely town, and I certainly plan to go there many more times in the future.
We have another question in the chat room from Paul Rook, who's asking, did Bram Stoker take any inspiration from the Mary Shelley books?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. One of the, when you wonder about a guy's inspiration, you have to look at it two ways. One, did he write anything down in his notes that lead you to believe that he took inspiration or little pieces of info from it? And there's been some people who were far greater experts than I was, about Frankenstein. And those two books really hold up as some of the earliest amazing Gothic literature.
Yeah.
And I don't know. There is nothing in the notes that anybody has found that says, that was in Frankenstein. So, Bram stuck it into Dracula. I think it's an interesting question because Bram was very interested in science. And of course, when you really think about Frankenstein and sort of nowadays would say the cloning of bodies and creating life out of death, that there is great similarity. But what Bram did was took his story of the undead from realistic superstitions, as opposed to the incredible mind of Mary Shelley that created this out of her imagination. So similar type outcomes, but different sources. And I think that possibly, Bram didn't want to make it just the same, and he went looking elsewhere. One thing I will say, though, that one of the letters that his mother did write Bram congratulatory letter was, you've written a great book. I think it'll put you on a level with Shelley. So obviously Bram's mom had read Frankenstein and thought of it as a really, a good, strong book. And to compare her son to that, did her very proud, which I think is very cool. So, Paul, that's a great question.
That was a good question, wasn't it?
I got to say one more thing to Paul, because this is kind of cool. When Shelley and Byron and the others were in Lake Geneva in this villa called Via Diodata, during that summer when the book was written, and also John Polidori, who was there as Lord Byron's doctor, he wrote a vampire story during the same holiday called The Vampire. And one of the cool facts is that the year before, there had been, this is 1815, there had been a massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia. And you think, what the heck has that got to do with this? But we now know enough that when these massive clouds of dust travel around the world, this volcano was so big that it affected the weather patterns all over the world, even in America. But in Lake Geneva, it created, a year with no summer. So all these Byron and Shelley and Polidori and others who went to Lake Geneva for a wonderful sunny time, very healthy and outdoors eating cucumber sandwiches and sailing and things, they had to stay indoors because it was rainy and cold and dreary. And they did what they did best, which was write scary stories. And that volcano is what really, created the ambiance and the experience for these talented writers to come up with the stories. So during that holiday, Frankenstein was written, and the first vampire book in English literature, The Vampire by John Polidori, which I'm sure influenced Bram. So I think two of those in a volcano had a lot to do with Dracula.
The other thing I wanted to ask you, when you got the journal and you were going through this and reading it, did you find, what surprised you in that? Did you find anything in there that was really interesting, that really surprised you didn't expect to read?
I was hoping to find all these things about superstitions and vampires and all this other stuff, and I didn't. But I found one thing. There was enough that Dr. Elizabeth Miller and I, who worked on this together, she did a chapter on Dracula, or En route to Dracula, we called it. And I'll by memory, I'll say this, Cass, and this will be a question for you to try to figure out. Which character do you think 11 years before Bram wrote Dracula was he thinking about with this observation that he wrote down? And it goes something like this. I once knew a young boy who collected so many flies in a bottle that they had no room but to die. He had lots of little things like that spread throughout the story, just ideas that he had. And so which character in Dracula was really into flies and bugs? Do you know? Do you remember?
Do you know my brain has went completely blank? I am so sorry.
It's okay. And you should get it because it's a name that I think Bram may have found in Glasgow, a street name right next to the train station and the big hotel that's part of the train station, and it's Renfield. And so I think he hadn't gone to Glasgow at the time that he wrote that. He didn't have the word Renfield in the book, but it was this idea of some kid just keeping all these flies in a bottle, but they had no room but to die. And that's strange observation, but he wrote it anyway. And then years later, when he decided to create this character, R.M. Renfield, and quite possibly named him after a street in Glasgow that he went to Glasgow so many times with Irving to do their plays, that it was like the perfect sort of, here's the name for this guy who's going to have this weird fixation with eating bugs and taking their life. So that did jump out at me as being something kind of weird and bizarre. The other thing, though, was that Bram had a pretty good sense of humor. He wasn't just some dark gothic vampire guy. He really did. He had made observations about things that were quite funny. Yeah. He had observations about people, partying really hard and and vomiting on the ground and then sliding in the vomit. I mean, really gross stuff to show that, he wasn't really stuffy guy. He probably partook with them a little bit. But the other thing, the final thing I'll say about the journal is that, as I've summed this up before when asked a question like this, I said that Bram was very aware of the world around him. And he didn't just sort of put his head down and head to work and put his head down and go off to his rugby practice and go home. I sort of envision him as a man whose eyes were wide open, and he would write down and make, record things that he saw. And in many cases, like the rest of his family, they were willing to do something about it. He took on social issues, and so did his mother. His mother was a lot like Mina, modern woman. She took on issues about education of the deaf and dumb, about working rights for women in workhouses. They were not a sort of a normal sit-at-home family and let the world just go by. They were a family of scientists and artists and civil servants that were out there to make the best of it and help the world be a better place. And that journal told me a lot of that about Uncle Bram.
Wow. We have another question, believe it or not, in the chat room from Richard Clements. Now, he said the Irish Protestant literary tradition is linked heavily in occult and theosophical circles. How involved was Bram Stoker in this?
I like this, Richard. You're getting a little bit deep, which is cool. When you say the occult, you've got to put this in perspective because, we understand through history, witchcraft and magic and superstition and things. Now we sort of look at them because we think we're so well educated, we understand everything. But I believe Bram and some of the circles that he moved with were very interested in things that we don't quite understand. Yeah. And there's a great there's a great quote about there are mysteries in life which age by age man may solve only in part. And that's one of the quotes from Dracula that I believe Bram is talking about what Richard's getting at. And that is things that were not politically correct to really talk about. They were people like Freemasons and members of these different kind of groups, Order of the Golden Dawn, that may have been discussing these behind doors. We know that Bram was a Freemason. We know that he attended a few meetings of Order of the Golden Dawn. We also know Bram was also an upstanding citizen and needed also to be the manager of the Lyceum Theatre and couldn't be too controversial in public because that could jeopardize his good standing as the manager of the theater. So he had to do things behind the scenes. There was an article written about Bram in a magazine called The Occult Review that I found in my research. So I believe that a lot of that came out in his writing, that interest in his writing about Dracula, about attaching sort of supernatural tropes and norms to his character, because it was an interest of Bram's. The other stories that he wrote about sort of the upheaval of the earth, the volcanoes and the geological forces that sort of come up from underneath the center of the earth, where the devil plays and the sulfuric gases, the evil gases from down below, and all these sort of things that were associated with the devil and witchcraft and things like that, that Bram could not come right out and say them all, but he alludes to them in a way that shows he was definitely interested in it. And I think in a freer world, he would have been able to write more freely about it. So, Rich, good for you. That's a great question. And maybe we'll find out more if more things of Bram are found somewhere in some time.
This is the thing. I mean, back then, it was a very different time. It was a Victorian era. They were very... Well,
stuffy.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, they were not free. They were not free to. I mean, what's crazy? Not crazy, but interesting about the Victorian time is, very kind of stuffy people, but inside their minds, at the end of the century, were trying to, imagine how the world is changing, new technology that was involved in Dracula, And I challenge your listeners to think about this. I do, one of my presentations has all the high-tech stuff that's in Dracula, like the typewriter, the phonograph, the searchlight, even the Kodak camera. These things, new sciences like phrenology and, of course, mesmerism, all these things were scaring people because it was change. And during the Victorian time, any kind of change was looked at as being potentially dangerous or evil. And even to this day, we're worried about, technology is so wonderful, but, freedom of information, all this stuff, it can go off like crazy. And before we know it, we're hacked. And it's kind of like that in those days. So, Cass, it's a really interesting subject. And in perspective, things like gaslighting, moving on to electricity, electricity was looked at as being very evil in some cases. Yet Bram and Irving were quite interested in converting theaters into having electric lights rather than gas lights, that sort of thing. So again, it's an interesting subject. I'm glad that you brought it up, and same with Rich.
Yeah. Now, to talk about your work a little bit, Dacre, it's when you decide, you yourself and Ian Holt wrote Dracula the Undead in 2009.
Yep.
Did you use Bram's notes to help with characters and things?
Yeah, well, that was one of the first things that I needed to do when Ian approached me and said, how would you like to write a book with me? And I said, well, have you ever done one before? He says, no, but he was a very headstrong guy, and he had a screenplay that never went anywhere that was sort of a sympathetic Dracula. It was really a continuation in many ways of showing Vlad Dracula, who is, the inspiration for Count Dracula, but giving his side of the story. But we needed to obviously really flesh it out and have far more parts of a plot. So I said, look, you're going to have to give me, some months to a year. I've got to go and, understand more about Bram. Yes. And one of the first places I went was to the Rosenbach Museum to look at the notes. And 125 pages of notes. There was lists of characters. There were certain things in the story that, like, I was starting to pull out things that Bram did not use. And some of them you could use and some we couldn't. In most places, yes, we had little, but mostly we had to sort of flesh them out ourselves. But the beautiful thing is we had existing characters that lived or are still alive at the end of Dracula. Of course, there's no Lucy and there's no Morris, but the rest of them live. And there's one other guy, which is the baby born 7 years after the end of the story. And, he's now 25 years old, and he's the son called Quincy, son of Jonathan and Mina. And he's old enough to sort of carry the story. So we had to think in terms of, what would Bram have done if his characters had just come back from essentially fighting a war. I mean, it was a war against the supernatural, and two of their friends died. One, they had to basically kill Lucy themselves, and the other, he killed at the hands of the gypsies. But strangely enough, there was other deaths, like Arthur Holmwood's father and Lucy's mother. Peter Hawkins died. So it was like, how would these people have been affected is what sort of guided Ian and myself to sort of recreate them, so to speak, modernize these guys so that, they were a little bit different than in Dracula, that some people didn't like, but we thought that it would have been normal that they would have had sort of this sort of what we called post Dracula stress syndrome, how they would have been. That's where we went with characterization. And then the story was, just using similar locations, although we set part of our story in Paris and there was none of that going on in Dracula, but of course a lot in London and of course in Whitby. So yeah, it was using some of the little kernels that Bram left behind. Of course, what was cool is I decided to have Bram in the story, so we had a lot of interesting Lyceum things and real things that happened, but also taking it and kind of going with it in a direction that modern readers would enjoy. And since all the other movies and TV shows had come out, what should the Dracula be like? This was, Cass, one of the biggest problems we had. Yeah. What Dracula are you going to have? And so we basically had to boil it down to, We love the 1992 Bram Stoker Dracula by Coppola and Jim Hart. So we decided to model him after that Gary Oldman style Dracula and go with it. Because you can't please everybody, but you better at least do one thing rather than have a little bit of everything and can then confuse everybody.
When you were both doing the book, obviously you've gone off and done research, and did you feel a certain amount of pressure to be able to continue the story well, so that it was like a continuance almost?
Yeah, there was tremendous pressure. I didn't really feel it until the book was published and the reviews started coming in, and some people absolutely loved it and some people absolutely hated it. And I didn't quite realize how passionate hardcore Dracula fans were to Bram's version of Dracula and Bram's epistolary style writing. But I have to say that epistolary style is very hard to write. And but I sort of learned a lesson, and that's why, jumping ahead to October, that when the new book comes out that J.D. Barker and I have written, it's in epistolary style. But back to Dracula, there was a lot of pressure, but at the same time, you've got to, alleviate that and kind of make your own mark. And if you just keep living in the back, it was enough to use the story that Bram set out and continue it with the characters that he created. But also remember, the book was written in 1897. A lot of things have changed. We were only 25 years after his story ended, but at the same time, it's modern day readers, and quite a lot of readers nowadays, and I would visit high schools, universities, aren't really, they're not enamored with the slow style of reading that they have to go through to get through Dracula. So we decided to make it an easier read. And many people loved it. And I say, well, great. Would you go back on Amazon and give us a good review? Because there's some people that hated it, and they're the ones that stick out there. But no, nonetheless, it was a great experience. First time through, I learned a lot of things, and hopefully I've changed some things in my writing and for the next time round. So we'll see what people think.
We have more questions coming in for you, Dacre. Gary has said Bram was part of the literary staff of the Daily Telegraph in London during the late part of the Jack the Ripper. Would he have seen evidence of this coming into the office?
It's quite possible. It's very possible, obviously, because although I don't know what he saw, and there was nothing in his notes about Jack the Ripper, but Gary and others, what's interesting in the Icelandic preface of Dracula, which came out in 1901 in Iceland, and we've now found out it came out in 1899 in Sweden, serialized in newspapers, an earlier version of the story that Bram wrote before it got edited down and polished up to be the Archibald Constable 1897 version. Even though the dates sound backwards, I think that Bram delivered his manuscript to Archibald Constable and that was edited there, but he took that earlier version and sent it off to Sweden, and it ended up in Iceland as well. And in that preface, he mentions the repugnancy of these murders is the same as the Jack the Ripper murders, which come into the story later. And so I think that's a little hint or a little homage to the terror that was evident in London at the time of Bram doing his writing. And I also think Bram was smart enough to realize that he needed to create that same sense of vulnerability and horror to be effective in his book. So he would have sensed that the police were not effective in helping the people of London. We know that certain plays that were being put on in the theaters and a play in the Lyceum needed to be changed because it was potentially too violent and people's sensitivities were so high during that time that they decided to change. So Bram was, as I said, very aware of the world going on around him, and he was going to capitalize on that. And so, Gary, I think he was very aware of it. He has a little hint to it in the Icelandic preface, and I think that he wanted to make that same feeling known. So as this supernatural count comes from a far off country area of the world that not many people know much about, and he arrives in London and buys up 3 properties and starts having these crates of earth put into these homes so he can live there, and he can start essentially, converting people with the blood transfers and creating his own followers. I think he was touching on those sensitivities and that same horror created by the Ripper. So long answer. I think there's something there. We just don't know the exact understanding, but I think Bram got the feeling for it, which was very effective.
Another question, Dacre, from Paul, who's asking, what do you think Bram would have made about the Bram Stoker's Dracula movie?
Well, it's different. And I think being a theater guy, he would have been thrilled that, in 1992, they're still remaking his movies. But I think he would have been a little upset that they called it Bram Stoker's Dracula when really it's Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, and it's Jim Hart's Dracula. I think it was a good movie, but it wasn't. It wasn't Bram Stoker. It wasn't a real faithful adaptation. But I have to say, I've done presentations with Jim Hart, and at that time, the world really, for the most part, people loved having that movie turned into a love story, and it's a good movie. It's just not Bram's book. There have been better adaptations. The BBC did a version with Louis Jourdan that was much more faithful to the book. Yeah. But it's easy to say, oh, it wasn't like the book. An epistolary story written as it was, with a lot of different scene changes and set changes, it was very difficult to turn this book into a movie and into a stage play beforehand. So it wasn't easy. There was a famous line by Christopher Lee that said, nobody has ever filmed it like Bram Stoker wrote it. And maybe that's just going to be the way it is forever. Yeah. But certainly pretty cool when people keep trying, because, I like to see different versions of it. I don't, I'm not disrespectful for people who make a good, honest effort in the arts.
Yeah, there is very different perceptions of it and interpretations of it, isn't there? Yep. There's so many of them.
Absolutely.
The other thing I wanted to speak to you about, Dacre, was you actually have your Stoker on Stoker tour that you've done. You were just over here in London, weren't you?
I was in London for 2 reasons. One was I was coaching at the Real Tennis World Championships, and while I was here, I got to do 2 really fun things. Actually, 3. David Saunderson of Spooky Isles put on a walk. He does he's got a great website and organizes some really cool things. And one of them was just 6 days before the anniversary of Bram's passing in 1912. I think we were there on the 14th, and it was the 20th, I think, that he died. I'm looking at my calendar. But anyway, we went to Golders Green Crematorium, and there's a worker there, a really nice guy that I've got to know because I was there on the 100th anniversary, 2012, when he told me a cool secret. And I'll share this with your listeners, that the urn that Bram Stoker is in, the one, and we see the facing to us, has Bram Stoker's name and the date that 1912 when his ashes were put in, and then his son Noel added to him when he passed away. But he showed me a picture, and we shared it with the group, that the back side of the urn has just Bram's name, and it sort of makes sense that when Bram was put in, his name covered the whole front of it, which tells me one thing. When he died, he was only thinking, I think, because if he was dead, maybe his wishes were to be put in the urn. Obviously, after he's dead, he's not going to tell him what to write on the front. But then later on, either his son asked to be put in here, so they had to turn the urn around and rewrite the name so there was enough space for both Bram and Noel to be written in there. So that was sort of fun to know a little secret on what's the back side of the urn. And we, I read a couple of the obituaries while we're there. And then we walked around parts of London where Bram lived, in Chelsea, in some of the houses that he lived. And I was able to give a little information to the, 27, I think 28, 29 people who were there, to tell them what were some interesting things going on in Bram's life while he was living in this house. And then we go around the corner and that house over there, and what was going on in his life when he lived over there. And of course, one of the cool things when he was in Cheney Walk was that he risked his own life by jumping into the Thames River when he was on the ferry boat going to work to try to save the life of this man that jumped overboard. And it appeared that he was trying to commit suicide. And Bram took off his overcoat and his shoes and jumped in the river and dragged the guy out and put him over his shoulder and ran home with him on his back, where my great-grandfather was there, who was a doctor, and they tried to revive him, doing, I guess, some version of, CPR on him. Yeah. But unfortunately, they were unsuccessful, and the suicide victim was actually successful in suiciding himself. But apparently, poor old Florence wasn't quite really happy with, a dead man expiring on, the dining room table. So they moved shortly thereafter, just next door. Not sure if that was the actual reason, but it makes a good story. But it was a fun tour. And then we all went to a pub and told lots of stories. And other people would tell me things like the movies they love and what the book meant to them. So that was nice hearing from them. And then I did one of these Stoker and Stoker lectures at a pub that Dave organized, which is fun. It's all sort of the mysteries behind the writing of the story. Some of the things we're talking about here on your show, motivations, inspirations for Bram writing, and some of the weird stuff that. So all very exciting, and I love sharing it with people. It gives me a great thrill when there's an interested audience to hear stories about Uncle Bram.
I mean, do you find, when you're doing your lectures, your Stoker on Stoker lectures, do you find, you will get people asking questions there that people are super interested in who he was as a person rather than just his work?
Yeah, and I think, that is coming out because, once you get over the fact that it's a really cool story and, it keeps you on the edge of your seat, but it is sort of difficult to read, and it's been inspired, in many movies and so on. But people are beginning to ask all kinds of interesting questions about, was Bram a member of the Order of Golden Dawn? Was he a Freemason? Where did he get these ideas? Did he go to Transylvania? I can't believe he's never gone to Transylvania. He's written a book where, the first couple of chapters in the book is in Transylvania. He's never been there. How would he know all this stuff? What hidden messages, was all this stuff about sexuality? Was this done on purpose, or was it done sort of, subconsciously and all that? The answer I have is I think Bram was very aware of things like repressed sexuality in Victorian era, and he wanted to give, just a little R-ratedness to the story. And so that sort of, the opening up of the neck and the fluid exchange was very sexual. To this day, it's not compared to other things that are in movies, but in that day, that was some great sort of vulnerable moments between, a willing participant and the suitor. So, I get a lot of interesting feedback and interesting questions, which I do my best to answer, and sometimes I just can't because I just don't know all of them yet.
You have a book coming out in October, don't you?
I do, and I can tell you a little bit. Can't give too many spoilers away. No, but here it is, because it's essentially the Stoker on Stoker, which starts with Bram's birth, essentially the way I tell the story and his troubled childhood. This is the beginning of the book, and I've decided to fictionalize a great deep understanding that I have of Bram Stoker, essentially from the cradle all the way to writing Dracula, with plenty of gaps in between, mind you. But when J.D. Barker and I got together, and I gave him the sort of the general idea of, okay, here's a child that's born, and he's had a difficult childhood, and certain things happen to him in his life with different family members, with a nanny, with different employers. Let's just pretend for a moment, and actually I have to admit a glass of wine or two helped, that he wrote Dracula as if it's real, as he states in the Icelandic preface.
Yeah.
That all the events in the story are based on real people, real things. And we know, or we think it's not real. I mean, maybe. And I think it's kind of cool to think, what if it's real? And if it was real, Bram Stoker would have wanted to warn the world. And warn the world by writing Dracula.
Yeah.
The other Stoker brothers may do other things to warn the world, being doctors. But Bram, being an author, the best way to warn people is to slide this warning in the covers of a book and then let the people figure it out for themselves, rather than if he stood up as an upstanding member of society and a theater manager and said to the police, Scotland Yard, hey, you better watch out, they're vampires, they would have put him in an insane asylum.
Yes, they would have.
So what good would that have done? Instead, he slides this sort of warning inside a book. And that's essentially what sort of Dracula is about, is what are the events in his life with some heavy dose of fictionalization to make us understand that Dracula is real.
Do you know, I can't wait to read that.
Well, maybe I'll get you an advanced copy. If you're willing to do a review, I could probably get you an advanced copy of it, because they're beginning to come out soon.
Oh, wow. Yeah, of course I will.
Well, we'll have to talk about it, because there's definitely ways to do that easily with sending manuscripts and things over the internet. So, yeah, and the cool thing is too, Cass, is that the film rights have been sold of this book to Paramount even before the book has come out, and they've already attached a very well-known horror director, Andy Muschietti, to it.
Wow.
He was the director that directed the Stephen King adaptation of It, that was a big hit last summer. So we're very excited about that. And we'll see. Obviously, the book comes out early October. The publisher in the U.S. in North America is Putnam, and in England, UK, it's Transworld. And when I was over, I actually had a wonderful meeting with Simon Taylor and some of his staff of publicity. And but when I can come back, what events I'm going to come back and do in the UK to promote the book. So we're don't have anything really finalized at the moment, but we're getting there. Yeah.
But you'll definitely come back.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I tell you, last November when I did a little tour to do Stoker on Stoker in Cardiff, Wales, Edinburgh, Glasgow, and then up in Cruden Bay and in Leeds. Because I've already done, London and Whitby and a couple other places. I really wanted to get a feel for the reception of Bram Stoker in these cities, and very well received. And it's sort of fun to follow this trail of places that Bram Stoker went with Sir Henry Irving when they did plays, and to follow up, a century later, and to go to some of the places and promote the work of Bram Stoker. So that's cool. I'll definitely be back, and I'll definitely let you and your listeners know when it's going to happen.
Oh, fantastic. I can't wait for that. We have a question again from Gary, who says, Dracula was originally titled The Undead. Do you think, Dacre, it would have had such an impact on our lives if the title had stayed as The Undead?
Quick answer, no. It just to me, the way you sort of, that Dracula, and the way Bela Lugosi says it, and the way others it's so powerful. But the fact, and Gary's absolutely right, in the manuscript, it was the dead, undead Dracula. We don't know exactly who made the changes, if it was Bram or his editor, whoever it was a genius. But it's obviously why the sequel, Ian and I chose the name Dracula the Undead, because that was one of the earlier names that was in contention. So, the other cool thing in Dracula, in the notes about Dracula, is that the Count was going to be called Wampir, which is an Austrian name for a vampire. And that's where Bram was originally going to set the story before he went to Whitby in 1890 and found the name Dracula in this William Wilkinson book in the Whitby subscription library. So Whitby is responsible for not only chapters 6, 7, and 8, but the location where Bram found the name, that just powerful name, as Gary pointed out, that made not just the name of the character, but the book just stand out and just be super powerful and strong, just like the character.
Yeah, but I mean, it's just such a powerful image. Just the name is just this powerful image. It strikes up this image in your head, doesn't it?
It does. And it's funny. Somebody did a study. I can't take credit for it. I don't even know the right numbers. But in the book Dracula, the character is so powerful that he only shows up in, I don't know, 25, 30% of the story. But his presence in the eyes and in the concerns and in the horrors of the other characters is so great that you feel him there the whole time. So you're right. He's sort of there, but he doesn't have to be front and center on those pages to know that he's there. It's almost worse that he's lurking in the background. You never know where he's going to be. That's the power of the vampire. You're not sure where he is when he's going to come into play.
Yeah, it's that mystique, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, so what have you got coming up, Dacre? What else is coming up for you?
I've got a trip to Romania coming up soon. Well, no, actually, just before that, the end of this month, a family trip to Dublin, because a good friend of mine, Brian Moore, who is an artist, created a bronze bust of Bram Stoker, and he created two of them with these GoFundMe campaigns. One of them has already been unveiled. I was with Brian when it was unveiled at the Museum of Popular Culture in Seattle. And what's cool about it, it's in an exhibit, and it's right near Paul Allen's manuscript of Dracula. So Brian did a second one, and it was always destined for the Dublin Writers' Museum, and that's where this will be unveiled. It's arrived there, and it's sitting there waiting for the unveiling ceremony at the end of the month. And so I will be there along with a couple of my relatives to do the unveiling, and then we're going to visit part of Ireland that is my great grandfather's heritage, the Macklacuddy, the Reeks area in Killarney, and then I come back, and this summer I've got two trips planned to Romania, where I actually lead people on tours to go and see places that the novel happened in, and also places where Vlad Dracula, the historical character, lived and reigned and impaled people and did horrible things as well. So it's the sort of the Dracula tour to both the Count and the historical guy as well as the fictional guy at the same time. So I've got a busy time ahead with travels. But the fun thing is the family's going to be on one of them, and the other one is my son is going to come on the next one. He's 26 and he hasn't been to Romania, so he's going to come along with me and help do a travel blog as we go.
That'll be fantastic, won't it?
Yeah.
Oh, goodness, you're so busy. You're so busy. Which is a good thing, though. I don't think we've any more questions in the chat room. No, we don't. I'm just checking, because if I miss anyone out, they won't be pleased. No, we don't. So with all that going on, when do you actually think you'll get a chance to relax a bit? Between books and traveling and...
I know. I tend to not, if there's a gap, sitting around is almost worse. I'm hoping to, one of my passions is fly fishing for trout. And I'm hoping to go next week to have with a couple of friends up in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee, just to get away for 3 days. A very simple life, not talking Dracula, not talking about too much else, but just getting away and enjoying the nature and pursuit of trout with little flies. And then, the summer kind of does slow down a little bit because one trip to Romania is in June and the next one is not till September because it's really hot over there in the middle of summer. So things will slow down, but certainly I'll find things to do, rest assured. I don't like to sit around too much. It's boring.
That is very true. Well, believe it or not, Dacre, we've actually been talking for an hour.
Oh my gosh, we have. Look at that. Yep.
That's gone in very quickly. I want to give a shout out to David Saunderson's, obviously from Spooky Isles, who arranged this interview tonight. So thank you to David for that. And also, everyone, remember that the new book will be out in October.
That's it, Transworld, and it's Dracul by Dacre, Stoker, and J.D. Barker. So keep looking for that, and keep an eye out on Facebook. You follow me on Facebook if you like, because that'll let everybody know when I'm coming over, and I'll certainly let you, Cass, and your listeners know about when I'll be back to talk more about a specific presentation about the writing of Dracul. And there we go.
Your family history is so fascinating. I could actually talk to you all night about this, but unfortunately I'm limited. But I think it's fantastic what you're doing, showing everybody who Bram Stoker actually was. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I feel good about it because everybody knows Dracula, and if I have my way, a lot more people will know about my famous uncle, the man who wrote Dracula, and that's my mission, and I sure enjoy doing it, and I enjoy being on the show with you. You did some great questions. Great conversation, and wonderful that you got some good listeners also to take the time to write in. So thank you to all of you guys that took the time, Rich and Gary and Paul, to contact us. Thank you for the interest.
Thank you so much, Dacre, for joining me on the show tonight. It's been absolutely fascinating for me.
Wonderful. You have a good rest of the evening.
All it remains for me to do now is remind everyone we have a competition running to win a mediumistic reading with Claire Hinks, our very own Claire Hinks. So to take part in that competition, just go to Parasearch Radio group page and click on the post. Go to the post, comment on the post, and you can enter that competition. All of our shows you can find on Facebook. You can find us on Facebook, but you can find all the shows on Podbean. You can find them on SoundCloud. You can find us on YouTube. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow us here on Facebook. So you're never going to run short of shows. So it just remains for me to say good night to everyone. Do you want to say good night, Dacre?
Yeah, I'll say something like good night, everyone. How about that?
Fantastic. Good night, everyone.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.